Hello, everyone. A very good evening to all of you. Here we are in the next episode of our webinar series, and we have with us Julie, who is the co-founder of the ILA Generation, and will be sharing the insights from the gender-based violence during the COVID-19 lockdown. So, wouldn't take any more longer, and would like to give the stage back to Julie to start with.
Thank you so much. Hi, everybody. So I'm going to share my screen so that you can see the presentation. It's going to be nicer to everybody to just follow what I'm saying. You will have something to look into. So let's do this. All right. Okay, can everybody see my screen? Great. We're good? I'm taking this for yes. All right, so thank you so much for listening to me today, and I hope that you like the presentation. So just to give you a quick background, not very long, as mentioned, I'm the co-founder of ILA Generation, which is a social enterprise supporting gender-based violence survivors. So we work with survivors from lower economic background, from 18 to 25-year-olds, and we empower them within a skills training program that helps them reach employability and become financially independent. And in this process, we also connect them with a wide network of purpose-driven young innovators, be it people who are employees of the corporations we work with, or work for, to be more accurate, or just people who are sharing ILA's values worldwide and are just supporting us and attending our events. And the reason why I'm insisting on this is to show that at the core mission of ILA is the idea that we want to tackle gender-based discrimination, starting and focusing specifically on gender-based violence. And the way we have been structuring our activities from the start was really thinking about the fact that for us, gender-based violence is not just something that happens to a certain kind of people or a certain part of the population, but it's something that happens everywhere, in each and every layer of society, and in all the places where we are living our lives. So of course, the training program focuses on survivors who are from a lower economic background and who might not have access to education. But whenever we're working with corporations or interacting with young millennials, for example, through our events, that are open to literally anybody, we also come across survivor. And this is something that I wanted to start with, which is that working on gender-based violence, be it since I started ILA with my co-founder Net, or even before when I was researching on gender-based violence, I quickly came to realize that this is about everybody, not just some kind of people, not just women, everybody. And you find survivors everywhere you go. And this is something that at ILA we really understand, because each and every time we're interacting in an environment, even the events, for example, we always have people coming to us. And the survivors who come to us after the events when we are hosting them are not survivors coming from Brussels or coming from slums. These are women and men who are high executives. These are students. These are people who are entrepreneurs from the 30 under 30 lists. So this is really how important and how widely spread gender-based violence is. And we were pretty much aware of it, but it seems that a lot of people were not. And then the COVID-19 crisis happened. So I'm not going to talk about how much this has shaken everybody, be it at the individual level or in the organizations we are working with. And of course, all of us had to take some time when this crisis happened to really wonder what we are doing with our life, or just how to stay relevant and how to move forward in the post-COVID world, whatever this world is going to be, right? But what happened at the same time, when all of us were literally focusing on the viral pandemic, was another kind of pandemic. So what you can see in all these press releases are articles that kept popping since the beginning of the lockdowns around the world, pointing out that the amount of cases of domestic violence reported since the beginning of the lockdown were increasing, right? So you have an article from the United Nations that is qualifying this surge of domestic violence as a shadow pandemic. And you have articles from all around the world, from France, from the UK, from India, from Russia. The World Health Organization also talked about this. And this is something that really appeared in the news in an unpredictable way, and that many people were really shocked by or surprised by, which was not our case, to be honest. So here are some numbers for you to look into. So in France, for example, after 1 week into the lockdown, the amount of calls on domestic violence helpline had increased by 30%. In the UK, 4 weeks into the lockdown, these cases reported had increased by 120%, which is enormous. And when it comes to India, well, an increase was registered as well. But to be honest, I found a wide range of different numbers depending on the states and stuff. So I didn't want to select one that might not be really accurate and not as grounded. So I just came back to a study that was conducted by Oxfam in 2018 in North India, interviewing men and asking them when they thought it was justified to beat a woman. And some of the numbers that came out were that 86.5% of men in North India think it's justified to beat a woman if she leaves the house without permission, and 42.6% think it's justified if she disobeys men in the family. And I'm sorry for the typos that I'm saying on this slide, but this gives you an idea. So these were numbers for 2 years ago. So this gives you an idea of the prevalence of gender-based violence that must be happening right now as the lockdown is still going in India. So working on this, especially being part of a company who is tackling gender-based violence at its core, of course, pivoting for us was not just about changing the way we're working and going online and having a tremendous amount of Zoom calls and webinars happening. It was also about wondering how to propose an answer or a solution, a kind of solution to this. And as we were learning more and more about what was happening behind locked doors, we came up with two main remarks and two main points that I want to talk to you about today. The first one is that to tackle gender-based violence and domestic violence, which is a form of it, you need to understand what it is. Where is this violence coming from? What are the mechanics behind this violence? And the second thing is that if you want this violence, especially domestic violence, to stop, you also need to give people back their voice. And this is a point I'm going to develop a little bit later. So the first thing is to understand what is gender-based violence, right? And it sounds really, really weird as a question, I guess, because everybody must understand what it is and has a pretty good idea about what gender-based violence is. But it's not as obvious as we could think. So the first thing to know about gender-based violence is that it's all about control. So the main way to identify an abusive relationship is to find patterns of control and coercion into it. And this is really important because very often when you try to assess if a relationship is abusive or not, and if you're trying to talk to the partners, you will have people coming at you saying, like, this is how a couple functions, or this is how a family functions. Like sometimes you have arguments, sometimes people are yelling at each other's. And even as neighbors, right, during the lockdowns, we tend to think that if people are arguing, this is kind of their private life and that we should not interfere in any way. Well, the way to look into it and to really draw the line between just a couple arguing and actually a case of domestic violence is to understand that for people to argue and for control not to happen, basically for domestic violence and abuse not to happen, you need to go from the idea that people are arguing as equals, that they have the same amount of power, that they have the same control over their lives, and that both of them are just stating whatever they think about each other or about whatever the issue they have. But in an abusive relationship, there is an imbalance of power, which means that one partner is trying to control and to threaten the other one, and that there is one of the partner who is in a weaker position and can't really speak for himself or herself, or can't really reply or even escape this relationship. So from the moment one partner doesn't have as much power, or one partner can be threatened or scared, this is not an argument anymore, and this is a situation of gender-based violence. So ultimately, gender-based violence is about control. And the perpetrator of gender-based violence is typically somebody who wants to have control over the people who are sharing his or her life. And the thing with this type of violence is that, very honestly, this could be prevented. So I actually think that I'm missing a slide right here. Am I? Yes. Okay, that's fine. Sorry. So the thing with this kind of violence that it could be prevented if we could learn to identify it. So we need to learn how to recognize domestic abuse and all its components, and this is the first thing, to precisely make the difference between just a couple arguing and an actual case of abuse. And the second thing is that for this to work, we also need survivors to speak out, which is really, really hard. We need to create a society in which we have the possibility for survivors to speak for themselves. So how to identify domestic violence? That's a big question. And this is the question that many people are asking themselves right now. Well, first you need to understand that this is something that has a timeline and that is progressing. So this is actually an interesting theory that was created by the Dr. Jen Monckton Smith in the University of Gloucestershire in the UK. That's called the homicide timeline. So this person is a criminologist, right? So somebody who has been going through many cases. I think she studied more than 300 cases of domestic violence to really see the patterns of it. And what she says is that domestic violence could be prevented first and foremost because usually a perpetrator of domestic violence has a past of already having been abusive or controlling to somebody else before engaging into a relationship. So first and foremost, if we were to identify perpetrators properly and really spot them, we could probably prevent them to engage into new relationship and start threatening new victims. That's the first point. The second point is that you can see the patterns of an abusive relationship being built quite early on in the relationship. And this is the stage 2 of what she called the homicide timeline, which is that an abusive relationship is going most of the time to start very fast and progress very fast, which means that this is the kind of couple, for example, that's going to move very fast in their lives. They're going to move in together or get married super quickly. The perpetrator is the kind of person who probably will say, I love you very fast. Just to increase the amount of control. And once you're right in stage 3 and once the relationship actually settles, this is where you start having domestic violence. And this is where the controlling behaviors like asking where you're going, checking your phone, being upset at what you're doing and the way you've been doing it, the way you potentially disobeying and this kind of things, being jealous, all these abusive and controlling behaviors are happening since day 1 of the relationship. But the problem is that they're going to increase, right? And this is what happened during this pandemic. So one thing to understand about this COVID-19 crisis is that all these cases are not new. It's not as if you had another virus turning people into violent perpetrators. The people who are now reporting cases are whether survivors who were already undergoing domestic violence, but because they were locked inside, found themselves in situations that were absolutely unbearable, and this decided them, pushed them to actually talk about what was happening, or were people who were already into an abusive relationship, but were probably not identifying it as such, and found themselves in a worse situation during the lockdown. So what happened during the lockdown is that, according to the Dr. Monckton, we went from a stage 3, which is an abusive relationship, to the stage 4, which is a trigger. And the trigger for somebody who wants to have control is the loss of control. So very often, if you're not in a lockdown, what's going to happen is that you're going to feel like you're losing control if somebody's trying to leave you, for example, to leave the household or to take decisions without you. And this is the trigger. But in the case of COVID-19, all the perpetrators around the world are triggered because they're losing control over their lives, over their movements, over also the way they are earning money for some of them. And this loss of control makes them more violent and more dangerous. And this is why you have this, we are all now in stage 5, which is the escalation. And this is where violence starts getting worse and worse and worse. And if you don't stop the cycle there, this can go up to the homicide. And this is why it's called the homicide timeline. So all this goes to show that there are plenty of stages actually in an abusive relationship and in an abusive household where you could actually start seeing that things are not going well and try to maybe just stop the relationship if you can, or actually reach out for help way before you arrive to the stage where you're at risk of being killed. The problem with this is that to identify an abusive relationship, you need to understand what abuse is. And even though we all think that we know what domestic violence is, we tend to reduce it to some cliches. So for example, when we think about domestic violence, we think most of the time that the victim has to be women, and that violence is going to happen, is going to be physical. So it's going to be beating up the person, hurting the person in any way, sexually assaulting the person. But the thing is, there are many, many other ways of being abusive. You can have emotional and psychological abuse, which means that you're going to threaten the person, to abuse verbally the person, to turn the person down, to make this person doubt herself, for example. Economic and financial abuse is limiting the access somebody is going to have to her means of survival. So for example, it's going to be not having no access to your bank account, having no access to education or to employment in any way, not having enough money to go and do some shopping or even have the possibility to go out of the house. This can be considered economic and financial abuse precisely because it's limiting the options you have to be to sustain by yourself. Digital abuse, when you have somebody using a GPS to locate you, when you have somebody using your phone to see who you've been talking to and restricting the amount of people you're talking to, when you have someone sending you threats via phone, via mail, on social media, you blackmailing you with pics and stuff like this is actually abusive, and this is considered domestic violence. And finally, stalking and harassment. So you also have the case of people who broke up, for example, and still have their perpetrators coming at their doorstep, for example, following them in the street, talking to all their relations, like their friends, their family, like threatening them. This is also considered domestic abuse. So when you start listing up all the shapes that abuse can take, you start understanding that it's way bigger than what we think, and you can be into a domestically violence relation and not be beaten up, for example. And if you want to dive into it, you can also think that to what sexual assault actually is inside a married couple, for example. How do you draw the line? How do you understand when you are a survivor, but also when you are a friend or you are like a relative, that what's happening inside this house is actually not okay? How do you draw the line, and how do you understand what is abuse? So this is where I'm arriving to my second point, and I think this is the most important one. So what I've been trying to show while describing what's happening right now during the COVID-19 crisis is that domestic abuse can take many shapes. There are many, many ways of abusing somebody that we don't even think about. Even I keep discovering some, even though I'm working on it. Like with cases of people who were forced to swallow some drugs, for example. But ultimately, the first person who could actually tell us that something is wrong and that a relationship is not good for them, the first people who could actually speak out are the survivors. So of course, as people who are around, we can try to help, but it's very hard to provide help when you don't know exactly what's happening inside a household. But the problem with domestic abuse and gender-based violence at large is that usually when somebody is facing it, they won't voice it. And I think this is something, I mean, all of you are close to empower people aware and others, so I know you're aware of that. But between the numbers that are reported and what's just the actual size of the issue, you know that there is always a gap. And this gap is related to the fact that survivors won't reach out for help for most of the time, or maybe they won't be, if they try to, they might not even receive the help that they need. So how can we actively give people back their voice? How can we work towards a world, or hopefully the post-COVID-19 world, where people can first identify abuse as presented earlier on, but also be confident and feel entitled to speak about it, which is a very big deal. So I guess the same way that you need to understand what domestic violence is to really start tackling it, you need to understand why a survivor would not speak about domestic violence, right? To really be able to help. And something that we hear a lot when we try to reach out to people and talk about domestic violence or try to raise awareness about it is that, survivors could, if it was that bad, people would have left. So of course, in the situation of COVID-19, it doesn't make sense because nobody can really leave. But usually speaking, this is what you would hear. And people tend to forget why, like they just overlook the situation and they don't think about the reasons that would lead somebody not to speak. So one of them, I already told about it, is the fact that you might not identify that something is being abusive, right? Like that a relationship is abusive, just because you've been told that this is how relationships are supposed to be. So you've been told that this is fine, for example, for a partner to be jealous, right? And that actually jealousy is a proof of love. You've been told that it's fine for couples to argue, and you've been seeing your mother and your father arguing before you and your grandparents arguing before them, right? So you kind of think that this is actually how a relationship is supposed to happen. You've been told that when it comes to having sexual relationship and intercourses inside a married couple, every kind of interaction that happens is legal and it's fine. So then why would you spot this one even though it doesn't feel great? Right? All these things, all these misconceptions lead people not to identify the fact that sometimes, yes, they are actually into an abusive relationship. Another reason I stated before was economic reasons. So I already mentioned it. If you don't have means to survive by yourself, it's very hard to live an exploitation and live an abusive household. Another reason is fear. So we talked about control and coercion. one of the aspects of psychological abuse is to threaten somebody. So some people know that they're in an abusive relationship, know that this is horrible, know that their life is at stake, but they will still stay because they evaluate that the risk of trying to live and potentially failing this escape is even worse than actually just staying there and hoping for the best. Right? The fear can be towards yourself, but it can also be about the people who are with you. Are you in charge of anybody else? Are you in charge of children? Are you in charge of vulnerable elderly, for example? And in this situation, if you have other people you are responsible for in their household, it's going to make this even worse trying to escape, because you know that you're risking also their lives as well. And the two last points are points I really want to insist on. So some people are in denial of the abuse, so they somehow know deep inside that it's not okay, but they don't want to even think about it or recognize it. And they also mistake whatever abuse is for love. So they think that, for example, being jealous is a proof of love, or because they fell in love with this person, they just don't want to acknowledge the fact that this person can also be a perpetrator of abuse, and that can be somebody who's actually violent or could even kill them. And because they kind of have this hope that things will get better, or that they can help the person get out of this abusive behavior, of this vicious circle of the relationship, they should as well stay. Denial also of the fact that some people don't want to see themselves as survivors. And finally, isolation. So one of the direct results of domestic abuse is that people are isolated. So your perpetrator is going to make sure that you can't see your friends, that you can't see your family, that you can't have access to anybody else, or that you feel that nobody could help you. And this is true in cases of domestic abuse, but if you want to extend it, it works as well for trafficking, for example, or even sexual exploitation, right? You will think that there is no way out anyway, and that the only hope or the best option that you have is actually to stay and to hope that things won't get worse. So all these reasons are pretty much explaining why it's so complicated for survivors to speak out. But they also go to show that a part of this misconception and a part of these reasons are based on what society says about what a couple should be, or what a family or how family should function, what should happen inside a household. So the bottom line being that it's really, really hard, first, to overcome the fear that you feel whenever you're in a domestic, like an abusive relationship, for sure. But more than that, there is a fact that it's also very hard to go against everything you've been told since day one about what love, what a family, and what a relationship is supposed to be. And if you don't see images that are different in society, how are you supposed to know what's okay and what's not? So I wanted to do this kind of test. So I picked this picture here. I'm sorry if it's a bit harsh to see, but I'm afraid it's actually the reality. But I picked this picture because I think that this young woman here is the archetype of who we think a typical survivor of abuse, be it domestic abuse or assault or rape, is, right? So if I'm taking it from my standpoint, being French, for example, being based in Paris, I could see that, like, the typical cliche would be somebody who's from a lower economic background, who potentially is from a religious or ethnic minority, because, these people are not like us. And of course, I'm joking when I'm saying this, right? Somebody who is beaten up, so the abuse would have to be physical and it would have to be visible. And somebody who is probably not educated, so who is truly a victim, who is truly somebody who behaves in an inferior manner, right? So if myself, as someone who's well educated and from a good background, was to find myself in an abusive relationship, I would have identifying myself as a survivor would also somehow mean admitting that I might be like these women. And I think this is really important to emphasize that many survivors, many people who are in such relationships, really don't want to see themselves like victims. They really don't want to see themselves like these women, because the problem is that this cliche of a survivor, of course, this is one of the faces of what being a survivor of domestic abuse is, right? But it's not the only one. This is the picture that the media are showing you. This is what the media are saying being a survivor of abuse is and what abuse is. So it's an extreme version of it. And it's a very visible and stigmatized version of it. So some people just don't want to admit that they could need help because they don't think that they are like these women. And they think that basically they don't, they are not ticking the boxes that would lead them to be like these women. Like, they are educated, so they can't be trapped, right? They have some willpower, or they are entrepreneurs or high executives, so they would identify as somebody who was fooling them, right? So for this reason, they would not go for it. Another point of this is that you can be a survivor of abuse and be a man, or be queer, for example, and there is no representation of survivors. First, there is very little positive representation of a survivor of abuse, first and foremost, but in the representations you have of abuse and what it could be, you never show a man, for example, in a position of being abused or being a victim. Or if ever it happens, if you think back about all the TV shows that you might have seen, or all the movies that you might have seen, a man would be raped or a man would be beaten up. Very often, apart if this is a very manly picture of like gangsters fighting each other or superheroes, a man being victimized or beaten up is somebody to laugh about. So you might not want to be this man as well. And this is something else, talking about the media, right? So this is a picture that I took from a Bollywood movie that I saw, that I pretty much liked, by the way, just because I'm a good public. So I'm afraid I'm always slaughtering the name. It's Rais, right, with Shah Rukh Khan. So really cool movie, really entertaining. But there is this scene that really, really disturbed me at the time when I saw it, which is that one of, for those of you who have seen it, one of the main thing in this movie is the love story between the main character and his wife, right? Who is there to support him in each and every step of their journey. And you have this whole thing about how they love each other, how their wedding is amazing, how they're supporting each other, how their family is happy. And then comes this very scene where the character is in trouble, right? He made a mistake, and this will have huge consequences on him, on the people who are supporting him, and on his family. So he's under a huge amount of pressure. And his wife arrives, right? So she sees her husband, she knows him, and she wants to reach out to him and know what's going to happen, what's the matter, because she feels it's going to affect her in a way at a point. And because he's a man and he wants to be man enough, he's not going to like show that he's weak, right? So he refuses to speak and to open up. And because she insists, he will end up being violent. So there is this scene where he gets upset, yells at her, pushes her, and she falls on the floor pretty violently. This is obviously a case of domestic violence, even though it's not showcased in this way in the movie, but this is something that in real life should never happen. But what's important is what happens next. The guy looks at his wife crying on the ground and realizes that he has just been violent, right? So you have like a close-up on his face, absolutely horrified. He starts crying. He rushes to her, holds her, says sorry, say I love you, whatever it is. And then it's okay because, he loves her so much. Scenes like this, you have hundreds of scenes like this everywhere in our media, in our culture, showing that, if somebody regrets this or if somebody loves you, it doesn't matter if the person makes a mistake and beats you up, which is not true. But the truth is we have so many pictures in our media, in our culture, showing that it's okay to be violent when you love somebody, or that it's actually one of the aspects of what being in a relationship is. And I think this is something we should clearly start questioning, because this is part of the reason why people are staying. This is part of the reason why people are bystanders when this kind of relationship happens and let people die. And this is also why the criminologist I was telling you about, Dr. Jen from the University of Gloucestershire, was saying that it's really easy to prevent domestic violence. It's just because if we were to question our biases, we could prevent this from happening. We could show movies in which basically at the first event of this kind, the woman just does her suitcase and leaves. We could have movies where you don't justify rape or don't even pretend that rape could be something that one enjoys. And we should also ask ourselves what we are accepting to watch on screen or in the media, what we accept to be depicted in the media, for example, as a passion crime, which remains a crime, by the way, but it's said to be a passion crime, and wonder what the younger generation are seeing as well as models of what a relationship should be. So it all comes down to, I think, a very personal point, and this is like a small story to tell, but I have to say that Shafiq had to run after me for doing this webinar, and a part of it is that I'm really disorganized. But another part of the reason why I took so much time to actually jump on board and do this webinar is because I kind of had an imposter syndrome, telling myself that I might not have that much to do or to show or to talk about. And a part of it is because I'm not a survivor myself. I've not been in an abusive relationship. I've not been beaten up. I've not been raped. I've not been knowing any of this, right? Thankfully. But very often people are quite surprised with this fact. I had people coming at me and asking me what my story must be so that I'm actually working on this issue. Because, being concerned about something is great, but most of the time when you're concerned about a social issue like this one, you volunteer for an organization a few hours, you post on social media, or you talk about it, but you don't necessarily focus your entire career and life working on this, right? Not if you don't have a really good reason. And I think that my really good reason, and I think the reason why now I understand why I can actually talk about it, even though I've not been facing it myself, is just because I came to realize as a young woman in this society that when somebody asks me if I've been raped or if I've been abused inside a relationship, my answer is no, but the real answer is not yet. So we live in a society where, and I live in a society where I have the chance to be educated, when I have the chance to go and co-found my own company, and this is amazing, where I can speak out during a webinar like this one. But it doesn't change the fact that the street is not safe for me, and getting into a relationship is not safe for me, and that I'm living every single day of my life knowing that despite what the media are saying, despite what people are presenting as some kind of really isolated events happening once in a while and very sad stories, I could be raped. And there is nothing, I can do some few things to avoid putting myself in bad situations, but ultimately I know that most of the time when this happens, it comes from somebody from your family or somebody you would trust. I could be assaulted in the tube. Actually, I escaped being assaulted in the tube when I was 16 years old. I literally ran away, and I exactly know what could have happened this night. And this will probably happen again. I've been touched against my consent since I'm 10 years old. And the only difference between me and potentially somebody else is that I actually fully realize this today. I completely know that. And the reason why I'm fighting is that I hope that there will be a point where we'll start questioning what media are feeding us every single day, where people are going to start questioning their own perspective on things. When men are going to ask themselves, for example, if they let somebody speak, for example, before giving their perspective, or if they really actually heard what they were told before making a decision. And this is the reason why I think the main takeaway that we should have from this COVID-19 crisis is also that there were many people around us, some people that we actually know about, who were in desperate situations, and we were neither able to see it, but also we were not able to actually reach out to them and offer the support they needed. And this is just what is exploding to our face right now. Because, so this, for example, are some pics that I'm taking from a graphic novel that was published in France. So of course it's in French, but I'm going to just give you like a quick overview. On the left, you have a case of a story of a young woman who has been literally assaulted in the streets. She had to go through surgery. She's been really badly hurt. And a few days later, she goes to the police station, and and this is a lady who is like waiting for her there, and who's going to listen to her story, and will refuse for her to actually feel the equivalent of an FIR in France, just because she should have reached out earlier, or maybe like it doesn't prove anything. So she's going to start questioning every single thing that she's reporting, even though she's coming. She has gone through surgery. She's obviously traumatized and shaking and whatever you can think about, but she won't be able to report this and actually get justice. And the picture on the other side is an example of another story that happened in a hospital, where basically a lady was coming to deliver in France still. And the doctors, including the nurses, who were women, were horrible to her and were really abusive in the way they were manipulating her, touching her and stuff. And this entire graphic novel that I'm showcasing here is actually a project that has been done by a man. in which he represents people who are being abusive or sexist in green. So all the men are represented as crocodiles. So it's called the Crocodile Project, so that you can't blame it on any kind of identity and just look at men at large. And all the women who are behaving as abusers themselves are dressed in green, so you can see them in green. And what I wanted to say, showcasing this, is that there are many moments in a woman's life, for example, or in somebody's life, where your opinion is being questioned. And when the feeling that you have of being abused and being hurt by anybody is going to be questioned. So you can be abused and go to the police station and notify support. You can be physically hurt by some doctors and still not have a say in what's happening to your own body. And this is something that's happening every single day. So how do you really expect people, when the media is telling them that this is fine, well, all the practitioners and the institutions that are supposed to support them and help them to go against this tendency to are actually abusing them and refusing and hurting them? How do you expect them to really come and reach out for support whenever they're in like a deadly situation? So if we want change, we need to start questioning the imbalance of power at all levels of our society, and not just between two specific people in a specific given context. We really need to start asking ourselves if we are really empowering people, which is the kind of a good way to finish this talk, right? Not just women, everybody, to really listen to themselves and identify abuse and give themselves enough credit to talk about it. Because ultimately, this instinct that will help you escape a bad situation is the only one that can also help us build a better society and better prepare the next generations for more equality. So that's it for me. Okay, I don't know if you have any question or if you want to ask me anything, if there is something that was not clear enough, maybe, let me know.
So I hope, am I audible?
Yes.
Yes, I have to thank Julie for such an insightful talk. I think it's very important. I think one of the most striking points for me was that we often, like you said, tend to see domestic violence and survivors of violence in a very one-dimensional way. It's framed in a very specific way. But by breaking down the cycle of abuse and by breaking down the different kinds of more insidious forms of abuse and how they begin, I think is the way women can actually protect them, women or anybody can actually protect themselves from such relationships. Once we learn how to read these little cues of behavior that can be physically abusive in the future. So thank you so much for that. I think there are a couple of questions. The first one I think is a fairly technical one. It says, क्या इंडिया में domestic violence का मामला देर से दर्ज कराया जा सकता है? Can a complaint against an abuser in India So can a complaint against an abuser in India be filed with some delay?
That's I'm not 100% sure. I feel that what came out. So I'm going to reply as somebody who's actually not filling FIR with any survivor. So if you want to add anything, you're welcome. But what I heard from organizations who are coming to police stations with survivor is that it's really hard just to have an FIR filled, first and foremost, not even talking of the delay. So I think that the more you wait, the harder it's going to get. And the more like arguments the policemen are going to have, the police officers actually can be women as well, will have against you for not to fill the FIR. And the main reason of this being like sexism, but also the fact that the more FIR you fill in a station, the more the station looks like the results are not so good. So they might not have that many FIR filled. It's better for their image. So I guess my guess would be that this would be harder, but maybe you have more insight on me than I do. Got it.
I don't have too much of an idea about the exact amount of time that is given under the Domestic Violence Act, which is, I think, from 2005, and it was employed in 2006. But I do know that this is one of the things that came into a lot, was under a lot of discussion when the Me Too movement hit India, because you had a lot of women coming forth and saying, okay, now we want to actually file official complaints. And then there were people saying, well, it's unfair that you think of this 5 years later, or you think of this 2 years later. What were you doing when it actually happened? So like you said, there is a whole lot of sexism surrounding this. But I must mention at this point that there is a very interesting acknowledgement under the Domestic Violence Act in India, and that is that India actually isn't very pro live-in relationships. Of course, I would say that this applies to heterosexual relationships, because nobody really worries too much about two women living together or two men living together. It's as if pretending that homosexuality doesn't exist. Yeah. But with heterosexual relationships, although there are a lot of housing societies that don't allow women and men to live together, the Domestic Violence Act does say that it doesn't simply apply to married couples, but it also protects women in live-in relationships. So that's what I know about the act.
Really great. That's really a good start. So yeah, no, I think definitely that's the Me Too movement has shaken many things everywhere around the world from this perspective, because it gave a new idea of like how long it can take to for survivors to actually speak. And I was discussing recently with someone from an organization that fights domestic violence, fights violence against men. So an organization that's specifically for male survivors, just because male survivors have nowhere to go. Like the great majority of organizations are explicitly saying that they're working for women. So if you're a male survivor, it's super hard to find a place to go. And what they were saying is that the average time for a survivor to actually reach out for help when they are a man, so whenever the abuse has happened, is 26 years, average. So it takes for a man 26 years, if he's going to speak about abuse. Which gives you an idea.
Yeah. So also adding on to what Julie said, I was also surprised from the insightful thing that it is at all the levels. Like it's not only the domestic violence is not only happening at a lower level, maybe with people who are like women who are not educated or maybe not financially that strong, but it is happening at all the levels. We have, as you told in the starting only, that we have many different entrepreneurs, very successful people who are also going through domestic violence, and they do not accept it, or they just keep ignoring it because of the situation which is around them. So which makes it more disturbing, because we usually are the part of it, we are going through it, but somehow or the other we do not accept and come forward to speak about it.
Yeah, definitely, it's really true. And there is a lot, like, depending on where you're from, you have different problematics. So of course, if you're from a lower background, you could think that, for example, financial abuse and economic abuse is going to be bigger, but because you don't have million survivors. But if you talk about somebody who already has a job and who could sustain by herself or himself, one of the reasons why you would not speak might be also image. You might not, you might think about your reputation, or you might think about what people are going to say, or even if you're an entrepreneur, I guess that you don't want this to happen, to change the image that people have of your company, for example. So there are many things that are at stake, but to give an example, the very first event we did in London, one of our speakers was a very successful woman entrepreneur. She is on the Forbes 30 under 30 list. She's brilliant, and we actually had reached out to her for her to talk about her entrepreneurial journey. So not as a survivor, we had other survivors speaking, but she revealed herself to be a domestic violence survivor during the evening, which is something that she had not done before. Like, she had written an article, but not with her own name. And she did during the evening, saying like, okay, it's time I start speaking about this. But this is the archetype of the person you would never think would be in this situation, because she was from one of the top universities in London. She had received awards from like the UN and many, many other institutions. Like, she is a very successful lady who has been pitching to investors and raised millions for a company. And still.
Julie, I had a question that how much do you think it makes the situation more worse when the kids are in the situation, like when the couple has children, and then when the wife or the mother is facing domestic violence and she doesn't, like, how do you think that it affects more when the children are into the situation? like the reporting maybe, or even speaking about it?
Yeah, I think domestic violence is really, really, really hard to work on, just because very often when you have children in the equation, people don't want to break the couple because they also feel the guilt of destroying the family as it should be, according to them. So they tend to like undermine the impact of seeing violence happening at home on children, compared to like the impact of a divorce, of like a family being separated, or like one of the parents missing. So there will definitely be an impact of having children on domestic violence. Also because people are afraid of what would happen if they were to report, which is another question as well. So if you're reporting that you are facing domestic violence and you have children, what is going to happen to your kids as well? Are they going to be placed, for example? If it happens that you don't have a job yourself, that you can't sustain yourself, and that you need to leave the household, does it mean that the children are going to be placed, or go to another shelter because it's assessed that their father or one of their parents, because I don't want to stigmatize the father systematically, right? But one of their parents is being violent, the other one can't sustain financially. So this is definitely entering the equation. There is a mix between what a family should be, so guilt, and the fact that from a very logistical perspective, you don't know what's going to happen to them. So yes, this is definitely going to make a difference. And this is one of the reasons why people sometimes don't report, because they want their family to stay together somehow, or that they don't want to be separated from their kids. I don't know if it replies to your question. Yeah? Okay. Just so, okay. Is there anything else?
I think there's just another comment to address the comment. Yashika says, also can talk of Thappad movie, just another example. Are you familiar with this film?
No, not this one. Not this one. I'm not really good in Bollywood movies, right? It was one of the ones I knew, and it really struck me at the time. So it's a great example, but I'm pretty sure that you have many others. I've been seeing quite a lot of soap operas at breakfast a while ago, where I was living. So I couldn't even say which kind of TV shows it was, but you had a lot of like violent scenes and people yelling at each other and crying in this, which is not a very good standard for a family life.
So we have another question, I think, on the panel, that how can we suggest different effective solutions of domestic violence that could work in the country like India?
Well, in this country like India, yeah. So this is always like a very harsh question, just because in India or anywhere else, when you talk about domestic violence or gender at large, it's all about behavioral change. And any person working in marketing would tell you that changing the behaviors of consumers is super hard. Like having people adopting new habits or changing their perspective on things is really, really hard. So a thing that we were discussing recently with somebody from the UN actually was that the best way to have people changing their ways, to have them questioning their views. So you need to give example or show people things that really are going to make them question what they think about the world. So talking about having them, like, for example, reflecting on Bollywood movies. So like the example of Raisa I took is a good one, in the sense that what I saw works pretty well with the younger people is to talk about pop culture, right? Is to show like images and have them reflecting on practical cases like this that are not directly related to their own family, because it's just a fictional thing. This is a really good way of having people reflecting about the standards that they have been raised with and what they think is okay or not okay. Working with young people is super important because they are the ones who can still shape their mind the most. Just because, human beings don't like to change their perspective or to admit that they're wrong. This is really not a good feeling. And it's worse when you're older. The older you get, the less you're like inclined to actually question your views, because it's like, it hurts more to say that you might have been wrong for like 50 years of your life, maybe. Whether when you're a teenager and you're actually building yourself and building your beliefs, it's easier to start questioning them and to like really select the values that you want to live with. So campaigns that are questioning the media, for example, are great. Campaigns that would help survivors like share their stories are great as well, because I think there is no best way to really understand what it is than to actually see somebody who doesn't match the cliche and the stereotypes of what a survivor is actually telling the story. I mean, if I'm taking the example of the lady I saw in London, I would not identify myself as the lady I showed you on the PowerPoint. Like, I don't see myself like a victim. And if I was to undergo abuse, I would clearly not accept to even see myself this way, because these are not my values. However, if you show me somebody who's so successful and who still found herself in a situation, then I can admit that maybe it can be me as well. So showing different faces of what abuse can be and letting different voices express is extremely important. And I think these are the campaigns and the measures that work the most. So of course you can always change the law, and the law is important. But I think that the best way for things to change is for people to change their mindset, and you change mindset by having them questioning their views. So you had, for example, a really good campaign as well that was done by the UN in India. I won't remember how it was called in Hindi because my Hindi is terrible, but it was about ringing the doorbell, and it was showcasing men ringing at doors when they hear like sounds of domestic violence, so that actually they would put a halt to it. And it was great because it was showing men in their position of power, like as somebody who's powerful and who can actually threaten the abuser, but using this power in a really positive way. And that, I think, is a really good campaign because it shows a very actionable way of changing things. So it's all about changing things at people's level. So talk about the culture, show them people who are like them and who came out of the situations and were able to talk about the situation.
Okay, Julie, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I really like the things that you talked about, and you targeted like different aspects of the violence that manifests at a very later stage, and we need to talk about it at a very early stage and what we consume on everyday basis and through the popular culture that we talked about. And someone mentioned the movie Thappad in the comments. I would like to tell you that it's a great movie, and the basic plot of the movie talks about a woman who is like a normal housewife in many Indian households, and she faces a situation in which she has been slapped by his husband, and after which she decides that all of the things that were going unnoticed or things that she was handling on comes to her presence, and she came to recognize the things that how she was being handled, and this is something that she couldn't get past her, and this is something that she couldn't sleep with, and she decides to divorce that person. And you won't you won't be surprised with the reaction that some of the people gave to this movie. Is like, how can a wife leave someone just for a slap? How can this happens if everybody decides like this? What would happen to the divorce rate in India or things like this? So, like you talked about, we need to create a counterculture to which we have been accustomed to for so many years with the movies that you talked about. I really like the content that you put on there, and the message that these movies give. And I would like to compare it with another movie called the Kabir Singh. One with the Kabir Singh. What was the name of the movie? I don't remember. Anybody?
I won't be able to help on this one.
Arjun Reddy. I think it's called Arjun Reddy.
Yeah. Arjun Reddy's movie done with Kabir Singh. Yeah. So the main protagonist of this movie is someone who is hyper masculine, who is someone like he's a alcoholic, but somehow he performs every surgery in a so efficient manner that it never goes wrong. And he slaps, he controls, he abuses, and like he's the person, and the audience sitting in the theater claps when the person.
It was quite a applauded movie. It was quite applauded. Like people were just dying because it was an epic love story. They felt like that, which was not the case. Like they felt like that it was a true form of love.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think it had this very problematic association that if you're passionate, you're violent. And that if you're not violent, you're not. It was a very, very, I think, dangerous association that movie made, and which is why I think it rung true with so many people, because then they actually had a way of justifying their violent urges and tendencies by saying that no, it's only because I love you so much.
Yeah.
So I think that is where Kabir Singh really, I think, caused a lot of damage.
Yeah, and I think the thing is, there is what I'm trying to something that I'm always trying to say whenever we're talking about violence is not to say that abusers are not monsters. Like, they are monsters once in a while. Like, they turn into monsters, but nobody is born an abuser or a betrayer, right? So they are also behaving according to standards that they've been told. So they've been told that they were supposed to be in control this way, and suddenly somebody shows resistance, and because they've been building their identity on controlling the others and ruling a household, it makes them freak out, and it makes them become violent. Like, violence is really the thing that you use when you don't have any other resources. Like, you become violence when you're feeling attacked and you don't think that there is anything else you can do but defending yourself this way, right? But you need to attack to defend. And the thing is, there is a need to talk with guys as well and tell them that loving doesn't hurt. You're not supposed to hurt anybody when you're loving them. And it's not like fighting somebody doesn't make it sound like more passionate, or I don't know what kind of standards they're working with. But the problem is that we have this so much, and we start reading this and viewing this from such an early age, even in like the love stories that you read when you're a teenager. Like, I recently was like tidying up my room because I have time to do this during the lockdown, right, over the weekends. And I came across some of the stories I was reading as a teenager, and I found so romantic. And then, like, looking at some of the features of it, I was horrified, telling myself like, oh, I used to find this romantic. But because later down in my life, I actually found myself in this kind of relationship, like with somebody behaving this way, you realize that actually in real life, it's not as like epic and romantic and impressive anymore. It's just annoying. And it's actually something that makes you leave, just because you can't live with somebody who behaves this way. So yeah, there is a lot of work to do on what it is to show love, and also how you express your feelings, which is an entire other topic to touch upon. And yes, and it's true that when you are stepping out of the standards, definitely you will have to face a lot of criticism. But I remember, like, talking about behavioral change, I remember somebody who gave this example saying, like, it's just like as if you were like you were, for example, at the beach, and everybody's sitting on the sand, and suddenly you stand and you start dancing by yourself. At first, everybody's going to look at you being like, okay, do whatever you want. But then if you have one person, then two, then three who join you and start dancing like this, you have high chances that at the point the entire crowd is going to be dancing like this just to have fun. But when you're the first one doing something, when you're a pioneer, that hurts. That's going to be scary. So I guess that to have this change happening, you need to surround yourself with the right people. Communities like Empower People, for example, or go to events where people think the same thing, just to have support and find people who are actually identifying the same issue as you do and are ready to fight with you for this.
Ed, does anyone else have a question? Oh, okay. I just have one other point that I would like your insights on. So I was speaking to someone who works with an NGO called Apnalay, and they work mainly with the slums in Shivaji Nagar. And one of the points that she made there, I think, really stuck with me, because it talks about how domestic violence and systemic violence often go hand in hand. And something where this is really visible is reproductive coercion and menstrual hygiene. So at the very beginning of the lockdown in India, the government released a blanket ban and lockdown, under which they, let's hope they forgot to mention that that menstrual hygiene products are essential, which is why the manufacturing stopped for nearly 3 or 4 days until it was clarified and these factories were reopened. So there is a lack of access to menstrual hygiene products under something like the lockdown. The public spaces right now, unfortunately, are fairly male-dominated. So I would say there's also a lack of access to things like contraception that a lot of women actually take without the knowledge of their husbands. So this sort of mobility reduction also will, I think, really exacerbate domestic violence in terms of course, marital rape, and then unconsensual, unwanted pregnancies, along with just a lack of healthcare for women. So, any insights that you have on this?
Absolutely. And this is also the reason why I the cartoon and I showed you like examples that are not directly related to domestic violence. One was like going to a police station after undergoing abuse in the street. So all these cartoons were made from real stories. So the way the project was built was that the guy who started this project had a blog and people were anonymously sending their stories and then he would illustrate them. So all these stories are true, right? So this story is one of the harshest one where you have this woman who really got like she had to go through surgery. She couldn't work for 3 months after the abuse. So it was a really, really bad one. And she was in a situation where basically she screamed in the street and nobody, like there were neighbors at their windows who didn't come down. She came to like the police station and people were told her that it was nothing. So there is something that happens in the personal like realm, which is like what's happened in your household and stuff. And then you have what happens also when you try to reach out to people to talk about it. And for me, you really have 2 levels. You have like the support that you can get in terms of institution, but you also have the support that you received before even this happened. And the thing that you were going through before even this happened that also give you an idea of your worth. When you're a woman and you don't have access, like what, like your hygiene products are not considered essential, what does it say about your worth in the society? So on the topic of menstruation, like we could go for ages because it's different from in each country. Here in France, basically, you have the VAT, just like in many countries, and it's lower basically on like essential products, and like menstrual hygiene products are not considered to be essentials. So we are paying a tax on it. And it represents like a good percentage of the price of the product itself, right? Knowing that if, as a woman, I decide that I'm bored of like hiding my blood and go outside not wearing any like protection and start bleeding in the street, I will be shamed so much for this, right? So I have this social expectation to hide my blood and to pretend that nothing's happening. I have advertising as well that shows me that because we have advertising like for menstrual hygiene products with like blue blood that looks like detergent. I never saw something like this coming from my body. I don't know for you, but this is the thing, like this entire part of who I am, which is literally my bodily functioning, is being censored by my society. I know that in India, you can't approach some gods in some families if you're like menstruating. In some places, in some villages around the world, in Africa, I think it's happening, but in others, in Nepal as well, you have to go to a house outside of to kind of place outside of your house when you're bleeding. You have so many examples of this, and you learn to live, and you just learn to live with this shame, for example. So I agree with you, and this is why I'm saying that we should empower people and help them own their voice. Just because if you tell them from day one that they don't matter as much as the others, how do you expect them to feel entitled to say that something was done to them, right? If you already tell them that they should just be quiet. And to like, if not even going to like domestic abuse, we've all been experiencing this. Like, I'm sure that you've been experiencing this yourself. Like as a woman, when you're, for example, touched without your consent in the transportation, this happens in France, this happens in London, this happens in India, like everywhere, right? We all experience it at least once. I don't remember yelling even once. I think I got upset once, maybe. And I have to say that I'm not a very shy person when it comes to like defending my rights. But in this situation, you always find yourself with this social pressure of being like, what if they think I'm hysterical? What if the man says I'm crazy and that actually he didn't do anything? What's going to happen? Everybody's going to think it's my fault. And then you just start reflecting about what you should say, what you should do, what you can safely do in this situation. And the next thing you know, like the guy already left and you didn't say anything. And you had a hand on your ass or on your breast and you didn't say anything, just because what prevented you to speak was literally the social norms. Because, worst case scenario, I could start yelling at somebody, and if I'm wrong, the person is going to apologize and like, I'm so sorry, I didn't want you to do that, or I'm going to survive to people looking at me, right? but still I won't do it because I've been told for so long that I should be quiet that I'm still not going to do it. So this is a learning process, and this is why I'm saying that as a society we should think about ourselves, like we should question our biases, like question the way we see ourselves and the worth we're giving to ourselves for sure. But there is also a point of like doing it for others as well. So going against the standards as well. So telling to like a friend who went through it that, oh, it's not your fault and this guy should not have done this to you. And these kind of things are things that sometimes we forget to say. And this is so important to like go against this. Like raise awareness, like for example, what you were saying, let's say, come to all the people who came to the government saying like, excuse me, but hygiene products are essential. This is exactly what you should do because this is extremely important. But if nobody was doing it, all the women will just keep silent, be like, oh yeah, sure. My body functioning actually doesn't matter. You know what I mean? So this is why I'm saying that you don't need to face a case of domestic violence, or you don't need to face it yourself or to have it around you to start working on it, because just reminding anyone, including men, when you tell them that they should talk about their feelings, for example, reminding anyone that actually we don't have to comply to these standards and that our voice matters, whatever this voice has to say, is the step one to actually being in a place where somebody who's ongoing abuse can get out of it. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Julie, for such an insightful session. And we learned a lot of things regarding what are the various levels at which the domestic violence plays, and how can we combat through it, and how are we literally ignoring it and not even seeing it in the world, which is it like a lot of it is already happening. So other than that, I would just ask you lastly that how you as an organization are like, what do you think that a considerable amount of difference what your organization has been able to made during all of this time which you've been working on domestic violence?
So what organization did?
Like,
yeah.
What could be the yeah.
Sorry, you were saying what could be the? I cut you. I'm sorry.
Yeah. I'm just saying that how is an organization, your organization has contributed to all of this thing, like in maybe in giving a strategic view to all of this domestic violence which is happening, to help people combat through it in different ways. So how as an organization do you think that we as stakeholders can work over it, like except the spreading awareness things? Other than that, what could else be done?
Yeah, that's a very harsh question. This is definitely a question that we've been asking ourselves at Isla, just because until now we're working kind of on rape and abuse, like assault and trafficking, which if I can say, the good point of this is that it's pretty clear. Like when somebody ends up in a shelter or is being rescued from Brussels, that's really clear. But when you talk about domestic violence, you have people who are sometimes still, very often actually, still in their household and who don't want to leave them for many reasons. Also because society, the backlash that they would get from like the rest of the world literally is too harsh for them to do this. And that's so much harder. So yes, you were saying, of course, spreading awareness is really important. But the other thing that we can do actually is trying to not just spread awareness about gender, but try to make sure that everybody gets what gender-based violence is, like what it can look like, for example, in somebody, to spot it. Because even though I've been co-creating Isla and I've been working on this for years, even like trying to increase my knowledge on domestic violence, just because with the COVID-19, I had to pivot with Isla to work more on this because it's the need of the moment. I realized that there were many signs that I would not even suspect. So if all of us had the same knowledge, if all of us were taking the time to read testimonies and to really know about all the signs, I'm pretty sure that we will react much faster when one of our friends is coming at us, reporting things that are actually abusive, or that if we see a neighbor that actually is showcasing something that is wrong. And this is the thing, because it's not only about bruises. Sometimes somebody who's looking flustered, for example, who looks very low, who keeps checking their phone as if somebody was waiting for them all the time, who are very quiet, who don't dare to look at you in the eyes in a shop, for example. you have some behaviors that help you understand that something wrong is happening. And of course, we don't expect people to come at, you're not supposed to come to see everybody that you don't know and say like, hey, excuse me, are you abused? Of course not. But you can still show this support that survivors feel they don't have. So something as just as basic as just saying like, oh, hey, hi, how are you doing? To somebody you're seeing, and basically showing that you're pausing to ask how they're doing, if this is a neighbor, for example, and showing interest. Something as simple as this can already make the difference, because it shows to somebody, to like a potential survivor, that actually somebody cares during their day, that somebody has seen that something is wrong. You don't need to mention it per se. You don't need to say like, excuse me, you have bruises and it looks like, no. But you can just say like, hey, I just wanted to check in. You look a bit low today. Are you okay? Something as bad as just simple as this can make the difference. So I think one, spreading awareness about gender. Second, making sure that people know about what domestic violence can look like and how to spot the sign and how to reach out to somebody to check in. And the last thing is, as organizations, when you are working in an organization on gender, trying to reach out to other organizations who are specialized on domestic violence and see how you can support. And I think this is also what we have been trying to do. We've been reaching out to the organizations we know who have been exclusively working on this and saying like, okay, what's the need of the moment? Is it money? Is it sharing the numbers? Is there a code word that we should share and stuff? And just collaborate, I guess. I don't know if I replied. Yeah.
Yeah, I just also wanted to ask, like, if you can tell us the role of alcohol as a contributing factor, if it is, in this whole scenario, and the upliftment of the ban of alcohol in India.
Okay. So any kind of drug, actually. So alcohol drug use is an aggravating factor, which means that you have less control over yourself when you're drunk, of course. So it can be even easier to become violent if you're drunk, but it doesn't justify anything, which means that you have many people who are alcoholic and won't start beating up their family. Right. Yeah. So it's just an addiction. I mean, it's a problem, but an addiction is not supposed to justify domestic violence. Some people want intoxicating. Some people are not intoxicated and are still being violent and abusive. So this is a pattern that you might find in perpetrators, but this doesn't explain domestic violence at all. And
like avoidance, like you also talked about, is rooted in the like power and control and the basic desire to have that.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
It also relates to the toxic masculinity and the culture that it promotes.
Yeah,
So concludingly, how to deconstruct this idea?
Okay, actually,
tackle it from the basic level, and like you talked about, we need to approach it. Yeah.
Okay, actually, you froze halfway through, so I didn't hear your full question. Do you mind repeating?
Yeah. So I was saying that to conclude, can you tell us like how to deconstruct like this idea of gender being seen in such a dynamic, as one needs to be aggressive and one needs to be submissive, and the whole idea of toxicity within the relationship, and how to, like, we talked about, we need to target young people, we need to target young minds, because that is how they are forming their ideas about what gender is and what are the expectations that are from that both genders. So how can we change this, and how can we begin to conceptualize something outside the normalized norm that we have?
Okay. Yes, that's the $1 million question. I'm afraid. I mean, again, like gender has been deeply rooted in our societies, literally all around the world for so long, and it has been happening for so long. And we, like, generations of people have been fighting these stereotypes and discriminations for so long that it's very hard to just give one good reply to it and say like, yeah, this is the way to go. Like, hi, I'm 26 and I found the solution. I'm afraid I didn't. I wish I did. It would be great. But one thing that I'm seeing, and one thing that I feel also, because I'm part of this generation, like which is the fourth wave of feminism, and I have a different perspective on things than maybe like my grandmother or people before me, is that we reached a stage where I don't think that aggressivity is doing any good. And I understand that some women movements, for example, are extremely, extremely aggressive and are extremely and really are really designating men as the problem, the source of the problem, because of course they are source of the problem, but I can also say that some women are perpetrating gender discrimination as well, and sexism as well, sometimes even more efficiently than men. So for me, it's about having this discussion on gender at the global level and in an ungendered way, which means that everybody should be concerned about gender, because gender has impacts on literally everybody, men including, non-binary people including, whether no matter your sexual orientation and your age. It just restricts the way you're talking about yourself, the worth you're giving to yourself, the way you acknowledge your feelings and your achievements. And this is huge. The way gender restricts our potential, everybody's potential, is insane. So I think being able to really understand how everybody is affected by gender, including the perpetrator himself or herself, is super important. Because these are all mechanics and patterns. So it's not only about telling to the survivors, oh, okay, you can get out of this and you can identify the signs and you can go out of the bad situations, for example. It's also about telling people who think they need to behave this way by saying, by saying like, oh, actually, you don't have to act this way. This is the reason why you think you do, but you don't have to. Or maybe we know you're part of a violent cycle. Actually, you can be treated for that, or you can identify when you're about to become violent. And I think this is a great video that I saw recently on the Instagram, actually, by a psychotherapist that was specialized in working with perpetrators of domestic violence, male perpetrators. And what he used to do was really to have this kind of discussion group and treat these people and say like, okay, so this is why you feel you need to be violent at this stage. This is how you lose control. So let's work about how you can regain control on yourself and how you can feel good about yourself, not controlling what others are doing, because it's also about deconstructed biases. The problem is that these biases you've been raised with are biases that are leading you to hurt each other, yourself and the others. So I think it's really about deconstructing gender for everybody, and also trying to look into the mechanics of this from the perspective of perpetrators as well, which doesn't mean excuse people from hurting others. Like if you're killing somebody, you have killed somebody, and there is no way to excuse that, right? But understanding how somebody is led to arrive to this point where you're actually killing someone could be helpful. So I think it's about having a more comprehensive understanding of the mechanics of gender for everyone, rather than trying to oppose people with like two binary camps, like sides, with like women from one side and men from the others, as if women were like always great and always victims, and the men were always aggressive. And you know, it's not, you can have discrimination coming from a women as well. So you need to think in terms of spectrum and mechanics rather than in terms of like opposite sides, I guess.
Yeah,
Thank you so much, Julie. It was just an amazing session with a lot of insightful information. And thank you, Hridaya. Thank you, Sumati. Thank you, all of the audience who were there all through long. Thank you for all the comments. And looking forward to a better world post-COVID.
Yeah, hopefully.
Hoping for that. And also all the very best for your, future workings of the organization. And it was great to have you on the panel. Great. Literally, it was amazing. I really liked it because it was very insightful.
Thank you so much. I'm glad you liked it.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. We shall be meeting